Right, well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. And in fact, I'm not going to give you the normal European type speech about what we do in terms of policy, because at the moment there's a big debate going on in Europe. And rather than saying we have the immediate answers, I want to give you a sense of what that discussion is about. And also to really give you a sense of what you are doing here and how this is important for Europe. Because I think certainly where we are standing at the moment, looking at Europe as a whole, we see innovation and Europe's capacity to innovate as perhaps one of the key elements that will help it address the problems it's facing. And I would like perhaps you to come away with 2 or 3 messages. I'm going to give perhaps quite a sometimes technical presentation, but I think there are essentially three messages. The first thing is that in an increasingly globalized world, Europe is facing an innovation gap. And this gap is a problem, but it's also in some respects part of the solution, because if Europe can catch up, if it can close this gap, then it is in a stronger position to face the challenges it will in the future. But in order to close this, what I call this innovation gap, Europe is going to have to find different ways of doing its policies and different ways of working together with the people who are responsible for innovation. So let me start. This is essentially the structure of the presentation. I will move from globalization through innovation into policy design. But I'd like to start very simply by looking at some of the positive elements of globalization. And globalization has brought all sorts of changes to our lives. For you, perhaps this seems very obvious, but for those in this room who are slightly older, cross-border movement, I think you mentioned a bit earlier, the use of social media, the international trips, people living outside their country, the number of students who can study in different countries. And in fact, the figure since 1987 is 3.3 million Erasmus students. So we see there are a lot of potential benefits of this new, more globalized, connected world we live in. But at the same time, there are challenges. And this is a map which we've just published in the European Commission, which essentially shows the readiness of different types of regions in Europe to actually address competition. And here you have different indicators which have been pulled together into a composite indicator. You have employment growth in industry, you have employment in low technology manufacturing, low educational attainment, and change in manufacturing unit labor costs. And you add them together and you see a picture which I think we are quite familiar with, which is, I would say, an eastern and a southern periphery, which is perhaps not so ready for international competition. And this is very much reflected, I would say, in a lot of the populist discussions we hear about globalization. It's the perceived risk that we face. And the perceived risk that we face from globalization is not only about trade and competition, it's also about technological change. And this is a nice graph done by McKinsey on the impact of disruptive technologies. And the thing about McKinsey is that they are always ready to put a number on things. And this really gives you a scale of the potential impact. We're talking here about trillions of euros in terms of economic impact from things like the mobile internet, the automation of knowledge work, the Internet of Things, the cloud, advanced robotics. All of these are going to transform the ways in which we produce, but the ways in which we work and we interact, and the workplace. It will offer great advantages to some, but also for those who are perhaps going to lose their jobs because of automation, it is something which is a great worry. So globalization brings a set of concerns, but also opportunities. And this is very much reflected in the way in which Europeans perceive globalization. The top line shows those number of Europeans who consider that globalization is a positive thing. That's an opportunity. And you see that there's a slight majority. Then if you ask the question, those who see that their economic prosperity is likely to evolve positively in the future, there again there's a majority. When you ask whether globalization is a threat to identity, here I think it was mentioned slightly before, this is something where globalization is seen to be a potential problem by a majority of European citizens. I think what is interesting about this is not so much the more or the less, but there are, I would say, large groups on both sides. There are potential winners, and there are also people who see themselves as potentially losers from globalization. Now, all of this is very, very complicated, and globalization, technological change, is really difficult to get a grip on. And there's an immense amount of literature on this and the impact of technological change on people's working habits. But there is one very simple story which we can look at. And this is linked both to globalization and technological change. And this is the story of productivity. Now, I'm sorry this map is perhaps not entirely clear, but you will see that the yellow line is the Euro line, and it is the evolution of productivity growth over the last 20 years, more or less. And what you see is a successive decline of productivity in Europe. You see a decline in productivity in the United States as well, but Europe is really in the worst situation. And there are lots of explanations for this, and I don't want to go into it. But this decline in productivity is a real challenge for us in the future. We live in a society which is aging, therefore we need to have the resources to pay for ourselves in the future. So the question is, how do we address this, and what are the causes? Now, first, before I go into what are the causes of this, I just want to highlight two things. The first of all is that this productivity decline in Europe is actually generating an increasing gap in terms of our wealth and indeed competitiveness with the United States. Now, if I showed you the trend as opposed to the absolute levels, and I also included some of the Asian economies, you would see that the line is even steeper in terms of the growth. So this is a problem. This is really about our ability to pay for ourselves in the future. And we see that the story in Europe is actually quite different, depending on where you are. And this is another part of the story I want to tell today, is that different parts of Europe are dealing with this problem in a different way. If you look at Northern Europe, you see that Northern Europe, in terms of its capita per head, is continuing to grow since the 1990s over the last 25 years. The gray line is Southern Europe. And here you see, in particular, the impact of the crisis, but also there is a longer-term process going on there. And then in the blue line, you have the east of Europe, which is in a catching-up process, and you can see there's actually a slight convergence there. And this produces, this is my business, this is the business of my part of the European Commission, is to address these different types of competitiveness and growth gaps in Europe. And this is a map of the levels of GDP in Europe. The more red you are, the lower your GDP, less than 75% generally of the European average, and the more green you are, the richer you are. And of course, in Munich, we're in a part of the world which is doing quite well. But we see that there are different types of disparities, and these reflect different types of growth dynamics in Europe. The first growth dynamic we have is a kind of catch-up dynamic, which is in essentially Eastern Europe, where countries starting from a very, very low economic level are able, through very simply foreign direct investment, through reallocation of resources, to actually achieve quite a high growth rate. And we've seen this, 3 to 4, 5% in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, in the last 5 years, 5 to 10 years, even through the crisis. We also have what's a kind of a capital core set of growth areas, and these are the internationally competitive parts of Europe. These are London, Paris, which are the world-class cities, but they're also parts of Germany, in particular, the Netherlands. And these are areas which have the sufficient capacity to really be global players. Then, as I said before, we have Southern Europe, which is going through a particular set of problems at the moment, but reflects longer-term difficulties in terms of their productive structures. And then perhaps the most difficult area to understand is what we call the intermediate areas. It's the places which are in between. And it's often the places which are in between in France or the UK or even parts of Germany, often the orange parts in the old member states, which have been the biggest source of populist movements in Western Europe who have produced the National Front, who have produced the Brexit vote, because they are the ones who are stuck. They're the ones who are stuck, who are seeing their living standards fall relative to other parts of the country. And this is a big story about disparities in Europe. Although disparities have been reducing, we are seeing increasing polarization within countries, between the rich areas, between the centers, between the capitals, and peripheral areas. And all of this is part of this, I would say, this narrative of a gap which is emerging in Europe. Now, what is the story behind this? The story behind this is one about frontier firms and firms which are far from the frontier. Now, I don't know whether or not you're familiar with this terminology or not, but frontier firms are essentially internationally global competitors. They are normally the top 10, the top 50, the top 100 in their industrial sector. And what the green line is essentially the productivity growth in these internationally competitive firms. And in fact, they behave, because they are in a globalized world, in a very similar way, whether they're in Europe or whether they're in the US. But the story is the less competitive firms, the firms which are far away from what's known as the technology frontier. And here, the yellow is the OECD, and the blue is the European Union. And what you see here is that in terms of becoming more productive, more competitive in our less developed, our less competitive firms in Europe, we're doing a bad job. And this is what is in fact creating this productivity slowdown, which I mentioned at the start. This is why Europe is slowing down in terms of its ability to become more competitive, not because it doesn't create enough global competitors. It is as competitive in many sectors as the rest of the world. But when you go down to less competitive firms, they are performing poorly, and they are performing poorly in terms of innovation. Why does this matter? And here again, I've stolen a McKinsey calculation. This matters because if we want to catch up, if we want to become a more productive economy, then there are tremendous gains to be gotten from those parts of the economy, those firms which are not so close to the frontier. And in fact, what McKinsey says is that 3/4 of productivity growth in developed countries can be retrieved by focusing not only on the best performing companies, on the best performing science, but ensuring that this diffuses throughout the economy as a whole. And I said at the start that this is a territorial story, that this is not just about sectors, it's about places. And this is the Regional Innovation Scoreboard for 2017. And what they do, colleagues of ours, is they produce a map of those parts of Europe which have the greatest capacity to innovate. And it looks very much like the GDP map I showed you a bit earlier. The more you are blue, the more innovative capacity you have. The more you are red, the less. And then it goes, in fact, red, yellow, green, blue. And in fact, you see that there are not so many blue areas in Europe, okay? But what is worrying is the amount of yellow and red. So we have a gap which we have to close, but we also have a gap which is concentrated in places. And the story for that is very simply because the less performing firms are concentrated in the places which are yellow and red. And the best performing firms, the internationally competitive firms, are in the parts which are blue and dark green. So what can we do about this? Well, here, the view from a European perspective, but I think it's one which is shared, is that we have to find a way of responding to globalization, to the challenges of technological change, which is smart, that's to say promotes innovation, is sustainable, but is also inclusive. And I think the last part is very, very important, because there is a sense in Europe, sense in many countries, that very simply, Europe has done a lot to become more productive, but the benefits of this, I would say, of the wealth creation has not been spread fairly enough. And it's quite clear to me, I'm from the UK, there is a strong perception in the UK that a lot of people got richer during the crisis. I think this is something which is shared across Europe. So we have to find ways of showing how not only we can become more innovative, stronger, richer, but we can ensure that the benefits are shared. And therefore we have to make a major effort as a society as a whole, as Europe as a whole, to do this together. And perhaps the key idea here is that we have to work at different levels. We have to work not only with member states, but we have to work with regions. And we need to develop together a vision of the future which covers all of these things which matter to us: digitalization, technological and social innovation, decarbonization, circular economy. But we have to do it in a way which is inclusive. And to do this, we have to find ways to address the problem of productivity. We have to find ways of moving everybody up the value chain. And we have to find better ways of collaborating and cooperating. We have winners in Europe, but perhaps we're not so good at putting them in contact with startups, with other companies which are not perhaps so close to them geographically or in different sectors. And we have to find ways of spreading the benefits of innovation across broader categories of the economy. I come back always to the same graph I showed at the beginning. We have a large mass of firms which is simply not taking up innovation sufficiently. And the way to do this is not to say something top-down from Brussels, or indeed from Berlin or from London or France. You have to actually work at a level which makes sense to people. And this is a level which is local, because this is the place where businesses, industry, and people interact. And this is very much the vision that we are moving towards in Europe, where we have partnerships between different levels, between Europe, between member states, between regions, between local levels. And within each of these levels, we also have partnerships between the private sector, between the public sector, with the research community. Because this is the only way which we see that we're actually going to reconnect, encourage diffusion of ideas, and create the possibilities to scale up opportunities from local to bigger levels. So it's not just top-down, it's not just bottom-up, it's a new way of putting relationships together. Now, I'll just say a quick word. I mean, this is essentially what I spend a lot of my time doing. It has a name which is called Smart Specialization Strategies, and it is essentially the way we deliver innovation policy for our part of Europe's innovation framework. Now, I think this morning or earlier today you had a presentation a little bit on Horizon 2020 and research. Did you introduce?
Contribution today about European innovation policy. Yep. Though I'm not sure everybody here has seen it.
Sorry, you can edit out this bit. But we have around 80 billion euros from the European budget over a 7-year period to support excellence-based innovation. But we also have, and this is the budget which we deal with, around 40 billion euros, about half of that, to actually encourage this bottom-up process of innovation. And it is very much focused on bringing together business and research and the public sector at a regional level to find new ways of working together. In some ways, constructing what perhaps happens organically in the United States or indeed in China. But it is a way of focusing very much on the specific needs of the areas in which people live and work, but also trying to focus on their comparative advantages. And this is a map of what we're doing now. We have what are called 120 of these smart specialization strategies. And we have a support platform working with them closely. So we have a very, very strong new community working on this new approach. Now, let me just say a few words in conclusions. The first thing is that globalization and technological change presents threats and opportunities that we have to address. This is a political imperative now. We live in times where if we don't address these challenges, whether they're from an economic, a political, or a social perspective, then Europe is going to run into significant difficulties. And there's been a very strong focus, if you go to the Commission's website, but you also listen to people like Macron, on addressing these issues. But there is not a one-size-fits-all solution. You've seen that across Europe, there are many different ways in which parts of Europe grow, many different challenges they face. And we have to find ways of making them more innovative, resilient, and adaptive. Now, this means that we have to, of course, continue to do excellence-based research, excellence-based work with the private sector. But we also have to work harder at diffusing innovation. And to do this, we need to combine top-down and bottom-up, and try and find the scope for economies of scale. Working across borders, for example, this is something where there's tremendous interest at the moment, where we have partnerships developing between research and business in different parts of Europe because they have complementarities and facilities which they don't find in their own region. And our feeling is very much, if we address these problems, then we have a possibility to really boost Europe's growth, boost its productivity, and also increase its ability to address the challenges of globalization. But this also means doing policy in a different way. And rather than thinking about top-down delivery of policy, which is very dirigiste, we have to think about ways of working which focus more on strengthening the capabilities of actors to actually do things themselves, and networking in both between different types of innovation actor, but also across Europe as a whole. So I've tried to give you a perspective here which gives you the thinking as it is evolving. We will bring out a big policy document next week on this, which will be part of the discussion of how we define the budget for the next 7 years. And I'd invite you to try and follow this debate because it's something which is important for all of us. Thanks very much.